Elias Cray walked into Tannen's cafe at 6:17 a.m., as he did every day, without deviating an inch from the path he had been following for years. His slow footsteps echoed on the old wooden floor, and his patched military coat, with a faded triangular patch, seemed to weigh more than he did. He sat on bench 12, his seat. But that day, an outsider was also there. Rodrigo Villar, who had just arrived in town, made the first joke. "A war coat at 6 in the morning. Is that theatre?" And the ironic laughter echoed among the customers. But in seconds, everything turned silent. A strange, suffocating silence. Elijah did not respond. He just looked down and sipped his coffee. But no one there found it funny. And what Rodrigo didn't know was that he had touched an invisible thread that held the honor of the entire city together. A thread that should never be pulled. What he would discover next would change everything. Rodrigo continued to laugh to himself, pleased with his own joke, without noticing that no one was joining him. The waitress pretended not to hear. A man to the left closed his newspaper without finishing reading it. A young couple looked at the floor, embarrassed. Elias, as always, remained silent. He looked at the cup as if there were buried memories that no one else wanted to touch. It was just black coffee, but his eyes seemed to be submerged in something more bitter. Rodrigo returned to his desk with his chest puffed out, unaware that he had just stepped into an invisible minefield. A sacred ground where time did not heal wounds, and where that old coat represented much more than worn fabric. The city knew, and even without speaking, they protected Elias with the only thing they had left: silence. What about you? Have you ever seen someone being judged without anyone knowing the whole story? If this moment touched you in any way, leave a comment below with what touched you the most. Your voice matters, and it can make other people see what sometimes goes unnoticed. And if you believe that respect, memory, and truth still have value, like this video, it really helps to move these stories forward. And if you want to continue following stories like this, with soul, pain, and honor, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes all the difference. But that morning at Café Tannen, no one could have imagined what was about to happen. Rodrigo returned to Café Tannen in the following days with a more attentive eye, but not out of respect. It was pure annoyance. There was something about that silent figure that seemed to defy his presence. Elias always arrived at the same time, with the same shuffling gait, the same weather-worn coat, and the same expression of someone who had seen too much. Bank 12 continued to be his alone. No one ever dared to sit there, even when the cafe was full and chairs were scarce. It was as if that space was marked by something that no one dared to touch. What bothered Rodrigo the most, however, was the fact that Elias did absolutely nothing to attract attention. And yet, everyone around him treated him as if he were someone who needed to be protected. Irene, the waitress, lowered her voice when she approached him. She said, "Good morning," in an almost solemn way. Once, Rodrigo noticed that she exchanged Elias's burnt bread for another, even though he hadn't asked. It wasn't a favor, it was reverence. The garbage man on Main Street always adjusted his collection route. I would stop longer on the sidewalk outside the cafe when Elias was there. An unscheduled break in the schedule. Rodrigo noticed that and commented sarcastically, "Is there also a ritual for taking out the trash now?" But no one responded to the provocations. Everyone continued as if he hadn't spoken. As if that kind of irony didn't deserve space there. At the city hall, the situation got even weirder. Rodrigo, trying to make some noise, commented on the old artist from Banco 12 during a meeting. He expected laughter. He only got low looks. The president of the city council closed the document folder, took a deep breath, and said firmly, "You better not say that out loud." It was the first time Rodrigo felt a certain weight in the conversation. It was no threat. It was alert. A type of warning that, even without being explained, said it all. But instead of listening, he got angry. Rodrigo couldn't stand not being the center of attention. He had grown up trying to prove that he deserved applause, and now he was in a city that seemed to revolve around the silence of an old man. It consumed him. Because nothing about Elias was made to impress. And yet, he dominated the looks, the gestures, the spaces. Rodrigo couldn't accept that. He needed to turn the tables. He needed to break the spell that hung over that man in the dirty coat. It was then that he began to poke harder. He began to sit next to bench 12. He spoke loudly. He laughed exaggeratedly. He would say phrases like, "Good old days when retirement was discreet," or "Some people like to be on stage even in a cafe." Elias still didn't react. He didn't look away. The expression didn't change. And this was even worse for Rodrigo, because the old man's silent contempt hurt more than any argument. One morning, Rodrigo came into the cafe early. He planned to leave a chair on bench 12 as a way of reserving it for another customer, but Irene firmly intercepted him. "Not here. This bank has an owner." Rodrigo laughed nervously. "Owner? This is a business, not a temple." She just cleared the table. But for the first time, he saw her eyes water. It wasn't fear. It was sadness, like someone who is forced to defend something that shouldn't be explained. Elias didn't show up that day, and it was worse, because the empty bench seemed to scream even louder than his presence. The silence of the cafe became an involuntary memorial. Late in the morning, the butcher arrived with a bag. He discreetly left it on the empty chair. Bread, fruit, and a folded piece of paper with the name Cray handwritten on it. Rodrigo watched everything, without understanding how this old man had become such an essential part of the city's routine, without even opening his mouth. At the municipal library, while looking for documents about former residents, Rodrigo came across an old photo. A group of soldiers in front of a deactivated military base. Among them, a young man with the same tired look as Elias. The same triangular patch on his coat. But no name, no caption. This only increased the uneasiness. Who was he really? Why did everyone know and no one say? Why so much care for someone who seemed to just want to exist in peace? Rodrigo didn't sleep well that night. The sound of Elias's chair being dragged echoed in his mind. The steady gaze. The absolute silence. It was as if that old man was telling him things without saying a single word. Truths he didn't want to hear. The next day, Rodrigo tried to seek support from his colleagues at the city hall. He wanted to find an ally who also thought Elias was exaggerated, annoying, and irrelevant. But he only found evasions. One of them said, "You're new here, Rodrigo, and there are things we don't touch." Not out of fear, out of respect. It was the first time that the word respect had a different meaning in Rodrigo's ears. It didn't come from medals, positions, or popularity. It came from history, from presence, from memory. And that was exactly what irritated him the most, because if there was one thing he couldn't buy or speed up, it was real time. Elijah had time. And in his time, he built something that no official ceremony could erase. Maybe you know someone like this. Someone who doesn't talk much, but when they do, everyone listens. Someone who carries a past that never needed to be exposed in order to be respected. If this story makes sense to you, comment below. Some silences say it all. Rodrigo didn't know it yet, but what would happen in the next few days would completely change the way he saw the world, and the value of an old coat. The city hall was full, stuffy, with that dense air of false solemnity. It was another one of those meetings that mix vanity with protocol, where every word seems measured to please or gain some political point. Rodrigo, comfortable in his new suit, led the meeting as if he felt in command of something bigger than himself. When he mentioned that the event uniforms would need to be impeccable, unlike the city mascot's rotten coat, the laughter came only from him. But something broke the air. A dry, direct sound. It was the crumpling of a piece of paper. A quiet veteran in the background, his strong hands shaking, crushing the event schedule as if holding an old pain. Irene stood up without saying anything. The mayor closed his eyes. The entire room shrank into a heavy silence. "You're throwing away something. You don't even know what it is, Rodrigo." The mayor's words weren't loud, but they echoed like a sentence. Rodrigo tried to hide it with a cynical smile, but inside he felt the blow. The room was against him, not because of politics, but because of something deeper: respect. That night, Rodrigo arrived home more irritated than curious. He hated not understanding what was behind all of this. What was it about that old man that made even the rudest people bow in silence? It was as if Elias represented a kind of collective pain that no one dared to name. A pain that did not come from words, but from experiences. When he opened the mailbox, he found a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph. The younger Elias was crouched beside a dead campfire, covering a child with his own coat. In the background were burned-out tents and a scene that looked like a makeshift battlefield. On the back was a single handwritten sentence: "Before you laugh at a rag, find out what it protected." Rodrigo didn't sleep. The image of the child wrapped in that coat haunted him like a silent ghost. Elias's look in the photo wasn't one of pride. It was that of someone who did what needed to be done, and didn't want to be remembered for it. That disarmed him. For the first time, he felt ashamed. The next day, Rodrigo avoided coffee. He walked straight along the sidewalk and looked away when he saw Bank 12 occupied. Elias was there, as always, with his wrinkled hands resting on his cane and his gaze lost in some point that no one else could see. His presence was enough to silence the street. Later, in the library, Rodrigo spent hours going through old files. Nothing about Elias. No updated records, no interviews. Just vague mentions in war bulletins, incomplete reports, and a name recorded in a classified mission report. Everything was surrounded by gaps, as if someone had made a point of erasing parts of that story. But the lack of information only reinforced one certainty: that old man was no ordinary man. That evening, Rodrigo returned to City Hall. He sat in the empty room, staring at the poster for the Victory Day event. And there, alone, he felt a different weight. For the first time, he understood that he had toyed with something he had no control over. That his arrogance was not just arrogance. It was a silent attack on a pain that was not his, but that he had poked at with sarcasm. The next morning, Rodrigo decided to face it head-on. He returned to the cafe. He walked in with firm steps and went straight to Elias. He sat down on the bench next to him. No one said anything. Not the old man, not the customers, not Irene. The silence was uncomfortable, but necessary. Rodrigo took a photo from his pocket, the same one he had received in the mail, and placed it on the table. Elias didn't look at it, but his breathing became heavy, as if something inside him had been awakened. Rodrigo opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Any apology seemed too small compared to what that man was carrying. He stood there for a few minutes, just sharing the space. And for some reason, that was enough. Later, during the event's dress rehearsal, Rodrigo reorganized the program. He asked for silence when Elias's name was mentioned. He suggested that no one approach him during the ceremony. And he wrote Elias Cray's name with his own hand on the last chair in the first row, without telling anyone. A solitary chair facing the stage. But the most curious thing happened the night before the event. Rodrigo received another envelope. Inside, there was no photo, just a letter. Written in firm, old-fashioned handwriting, with just a few words. Respect is not demanded. It is lived, and kept quiet. That ended any remaining resistance within him. Rodrigo knew that his job was not to fix anything. At most, it was to not disrupt what had already been honored in silence for decades. The event has arrived. The city was in full swing. Flowers everywhere. Children with flags, rehearsed marching band, veterans lined up. And there in the back, sitting as always, Elias watched. With the old coat, the tight beret, and that look that no one could decipher. Rodrigo saw him, and he said nothing. He just nodded. Elijah did not reciprocate, but it remained there, firm, present, like someone who understands that sometimes the greatest gesture is not to leave. This kind of presence, which asks for nothing but teaches everything, is rare. If you feel that you have also gone through something that no one understood, that you had to carry in silence pain that the world does not see, write here in the comments. Not everything that weighs can be seen. The truth is that there are stories so profound that only time has the courage to tell them. And there is more that you still don't know about Elias Cray. Rodrigo could no longer escape it. The more he tried to ignore Elias's silent presence, the more it surrounded him. He began to wake up earlier, watching the first movements of the city from the upper floor window of the city hall. And there he was. Always him. Elias Cray, crossing the square, while the fog still hugged the streetlights. His faded coat brushing his thin legs, his beret slightly tilted, his cane tapping the ground like a funereal metronome of a memory that would not pass. That was when Rodrigo decided to really look. He went into the municipal archives and asked for permission to access old records, yellow pages that smelled of the past. He looked for military records, interviews, reports, but what he found was almost nothing. Just Elias's name on a forgotten list, stained by time and dust. Mission of no return, the report said. Incomplete file. Classified. That lack of information hurt more than any confession. It was as if someone had purposely erased Elias's story, or worse, as if he himself had asked to be forgotten. But why? Meanwhile, rumors were taking shape. Discreet voices began to reach Rodrigo with small fragments. Whispers. Memories shared in secret. Teacher Letty said, with tears in her eyes, that one day, when she was leaving school late, she was surprised by 2 hooded men. One of them grabbed her by the arm. She screamed. And out of nowhere, an old man appeared. He didn't say anything. He just stood between her and the 2. One of them ran. The other hesitated. Elias didn't raise his voice. He just looked. A look she said she would never forget. The man released Letty and disappeared. Elias just helped her collect the books and left. He never commented on what happened. I never wanted gratitude. At the library, the young intern reported that every month an envelope containing cash donations would appear, addressed to peace projects. There was always no return address. But one time, a security camera caught someone leaving the envelope in the box. The image was blurry, but there was no doubt. It was Elias. And on All Souls' Day mornings, well before the first Mass, there was always an elderly man who would clean the graves in the military sector with his own hands. He would wipe the names, arrange the wilted flowers, and remove dead leaves. When the first visitors arrived, he had already disappeared. No one ever dared to approach him. It was as if it were part of a personal ritual, too sacred to be interrupted. Rodrigo listened to all this in silence. And with each new piece of this painful puzzle, he felt the weight of shame grow heavier. He, who had laughed at a coat, now found himself faced with a story stitched together by losses that would never be told in full. And the deeper he delved into this journey, the more Elias became an indecipherable figure. The kind of man who doesn't wear medals on his chest, but scars that the eyes don't see. One afternoon, Rodrigo found Irene sitting in the back of the cafe, alone, rolling napkins with unusual slowness. He approached her awkwardly and asked, "Have you tried talking to him? For real?" She hesitated. Then she replied with a sad smile. "Elias is not one to talk. He listens. He has always listened more than he has spoken. But there is one thing I have learned from him, is that there are people who have already shouted so much inside that they choose silence as a form of peace." Rodrigo did not respond. He stood there, staring at Irene's hands, which were now shaking. And it was at that moment that he realized something new. It was not just Elijah who carried invisible marks. The whole city had pieces of him scattered around, and everyone knew it. Everyone protected. But no one explained what that damn triangular patch hand-sewn on the coat meant. Rodrigo tried to find out. He called military archives, sent messages to journalists, and even searched among collectors. The answer was always the same. We don't know. It looks handmade, rare, maybe from a defunct unit. That's when he had an idea. He took the photo he had received in the mail, the one in which Elias appeared with the child wrapped in the coat, and enlarged it. He used filters, increased the resolution, and then he saw it. In the bottom right corner, very discreetly, it was written, Redmont 7 Delta. This entry was not in any known military database, but that was enough for Rodrigo to start finding clues. In a closed forum for ex-combatants, there was mention of a reconnaissance and rescue group informally named 7 Deltas, a unit that had allegedly acted in unofficial missions during failed evacuation operations. Most of them had died in the field, and the survivors, for ethical or strategic reasons, had their stories buried. Rodrigo felt a shiver. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about responsibility. The hidden truth he now carried could not be ignored. The old man from Bank 12 was not just a symbol of the city. It was the last living link to a part of history that the entire country had preferred to forget. And yet, Elijah didn't tell anyone. He kept drinking his coffee. He kept being silent. He kept just being. Rodrigo, inside, was falling apart. His mind tried to reconcile it all. The arrogance he had, the hasty judgment, the unrecognized pain, the neglected wisdom. It was as if I had offended an altar, without realizing it was an altar. But even so, there was time to honor. If this story makes sense to you, comment here. Not all silence is empty. And if you think this is already deep, you haven't seen what's going to happen on Victory Day yet. The sound of the marching band tuning their instruments mingled with the excited buzz of the audience. The sky was clear, with that blue hue that seems tailor-made for civic days. The chairs lined up in front of the stage gleamed in the sun, covered with white cloths and blue ribbons. Rodrigo paced back and forth, clipboard in hand, reviewing every detail of the protocol. The Victory Day event was the pinnacle of the city's calendar, and he had to make sure everything went off with military precision. But as he turned to check the band's position, his eyes froze for a second. There, in the back, barely visible in the crowd, was Elias, sitting silently on the same bench 12 that had been brought in especially for the ceremony. The only piece of furniture in the cafe that now occupied a place of honor in the middle of the civic center. Rodrigo pressed his lips together and took a deep breath. For a moment, he considered looking away and pretending he hadn't seen him. But something inside him, pride perhaps, pushed him toward the old man. And, as if he were returning a poorly healed wound, he approached with his usual arrogance. He bent down slightly and whispered ironically, "Today, you're going to be the main attraction, aren't you?" But this time, with applause. Elias did not react. He didn't even look up. He just stared at the ground, as if he were looking for something there that no one else could see. What Rodrigo didn't realize right away was that that lack of response hurt more than any words. Because sometimes silence carries a kind of contempt that cannot be ignored. And there he was, a man invisible to the documents, ignored by the records, but revered by the silent gestures of an entire city. A man who, even when humiliated in front of everyone, remained dignified, immobile, whole. While Rodrigo, so full of speeches, felt increasingly smaller in front of the one who said nothing, but said everything. The ceremony began with the national anthem, the banners being raised, the protocol speeches of the councillors and secretaries being read with forced enthusiasm. But there was a tension in the air, an expectation that no one could explain, as if something bigger was about to happen. The mayor, wearing her tricolour sash on her chest, went up on stage to announce the presence of a special guest, General Laura Duarte of the 7th Elite Brigade, a living legend among the military. Rodrigo followed the general's every step with attentive eyes, trying to convey confidence. She approached the microphone, adjusted her posture, and began her speech firmly. She spoke of values, of legacy, of bravery that spans generations. But at a certain point, she stopped. Her eyes fixed on a point in the back of the crowd. Silence. She parted her lips, hesitated. Then, in an unexpected movement, she took off her beret, went down the stairs from the stage, and began to walk among the chairs. The audience watched with uneasiness, not understanding what was happening. Rodrigo followed her with his eyes, paralyzed, And then she stopped. In front of the old coat. In front of the forgotten man. In front of Elias Cray. She remained silent for a few seconds, as if she needed to overcome a weight on her chest. Then she placed 2 fingers on the triangular patch on her coat and saluted. The sound was dry, clean, strong. The crowd, which had been murmuring between smiles and conversations, fell completely silent. Not a single child moved. Not a single chair creaked. It was as if the world had stopped for a whole second. And then she said, "This patch is not symbolic. It is sacred." It was awarded to only 4 soldiers. 3 died on the mission. This man is the last. Rodrigo felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. His hands sweated. His throat went dry. The papers on the clipboard slipped and flew to the side, but no one noticed, because at that moment, the entire city only had eyes for Elijah. An old man with a tired look and hands marked by time, who until then had been the target of laughter, was now the living representation of everything that ceremony claimed to defend. The mayor placed her hand on her chest. The band lowered their instruments. Some of the veterans present struggled to their feet and one by one saluted as well. Silent, deep, honest. Rodrigo stood motionless, between shame and admiration, between regret and epiphany. Because only then, only at that exact moment, did he understand the hidden truth that he had spent days trying to uncover with documents, forums, and records. Elias was not a name. Elias was a symbol, an invisible pillar that supported the values of that city, not with speeches, but with silent actions, anonymous gestures, and a constant presence that, even when ignored, always made a difference. The event continued, but something had changed. No one spoke out loud. No one took their eyes off him. And Elijah just looked back up at the sky, with a slight nod, as if he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. This scene was etched in the minds of everyone who was there. But what no one imagined was what Elijah would do the next day. Comment here. Now it all makes sense. Let's continue. The next morning, bench 12 was empty. For the first time in years, there were no slow footsteps scuffing the floor of Café Tannen at 6:17 a.m. No worn coat. No beret. No smell of fresh coffee mixed with heavy silence. There was only absence. And on the wooden bench, neatly folded, lay the old coat. It hadn't been left haphazardly. It was positioned with almost ceremonial precision. The worn stitching lined up with the edges of the seat, the triangular patch facing up as if to say, "Mission complete." On the fabric was a handwritten note, short and to the point, as Elias himself had always been. Some honors are carried in silence. No one knew exactly what to do. Irene stood in front of the bench for a few seconds and put her hand to her chest. She didn't bother to hide her tears in her eyes. She simply picked up the coat with the greatest care in the world, as if she were touching someone's story that could no longer be put into words. Rodrigo arrived shortly after. He no longer carried a clipboard or an air of superiority. He carried only shame in his eyes and a heart crushed by his conscience. He stopped next to the bench, saw the emptiness, and finally understood. Elias was gone. Not physically, not yet, but symbolically. What he needed to show, really show, had already been done. Now it was time to disappear as he had always lived. In peace, on the sidelines, in silence. In the following days, Rodrigo plunged into a different kind of obsession. It was no longer about discovering Elias's past. It was about protecting him. Keep it. Honor him. He spent hours in the library organizing records. He discreetly interviewed people who knew him. He called old colleagues from the war years. Many had already left. Others barely remembered the name. But one thing everyone said. He was the one who did what no one else wanted to do. He wasn't looking for applause. He didn't accept promotions. He was always the first one in, and the last one out. On rescue missions, he would stay behind to make sure the others got out alive. It was known by the code Delta Final. When the radio said Final Delta has arrived, it meant no one was in danger anymore, that Elijah was there, and that everyone could breathe. But those who take care of everyone usually forget about themselves. Rodrigo found a yellowed newspaper clipping in a rusty box at the city hall. No signature. A small, almost invisible note. It said, "Anonymous veteran saves 3 children during fire at abandoned shelter. Refuses interview." Beside it, a black and white image. The outline of the face was familiar. The same heavy gaze. The same silence. It was Elias. Always him. Present where no one expected. Disappearing before gratitude could reach him. So, Rodrigo decided to do something that Elias might never approve of, but that the town needed. He took his coat to the library. With the help of the community, he built a small memorial. Not grand, not modern, just real. A simple display case made of dark wood. Inside it, his coat. Beside it, a single photo. Elias in front of the monument to the fallen, kneeling at dawn, wiping away the names with an old handkerchief. It was the only image he himself had never known existed. On the pedestal, 3 words were engraved with hot iron. He taught us. And it was true. Elias taught with his eyes, with the absence of words, with his firm presence behind the scenes. He taught that true legacy does not need the spotlight. It only needs coherence between what is lived and what is kept silent. Rodrigo began visiting the memorial every day before opening the city hall. Sometimes just to be silent, sometimes to talk to no one. But I always left there feeling lighter, as if some of the weight he carried had been forgiven, not with words, but with time, and with the example. One Sunday afternoon, Elias was found, sitting on a bench in the Redmont Military Cemetery in front of an unmarked headstone. His hands were resting on his lap. His eyes were fixed on a white flower. Beside him was another flower and an old military radio. Rodrigo approached. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to him. The two remained there for minutes that seemed like hours. Elias didn't look at him, but sighed deeply. And in that sigh, there was everything. Memory, pain, longing, peace. Rodrigo, without really understanding why, took a cloth handkerchief out of his pocket, the same one Elias used to clean the tombs. He had kept it with him since the day of the event. He slowly spread it out and placed it on the tombstone. Elias closed his eyes. That night it rained. Not much, but enough to wash the streets. The next morning, at Café Tannen, Bench 12 was repositioned. Not for use, but as a piece of memory. A small plaque was placed above the backrest, reserved for those who have seen more than they have spoken. And with that, the city moved on. Changed, silent, but with something new pulsing between the corners. The understanding that there are people who live so deep within the truth that the world only notices when they disappear. If this chapter spoke to you in any way, comment below. I also carry in silence. Let's continue. The wind that morning seemed to carry more than just dry leaves. There was something in the air that not even the silence could explain. A feeling that something had changed forever. Rodrigo walked slowly down Redmont's main street, his shoes clicking on the asphalt, as if marking the end of a journey that had gone too far. The steps led him to the library, where the newly installed display case now occupied the central hall. Elias's coat was there. Folded with almost surgical precision, it was displayed under a clean, cool glass. The soft light that illuminated it cast shadows over the patches, and each seam looked like a visible scar from a war that no one remembered anymore, except him. And now, perhaps, Rodrigo too. On the plaque, the 3 words echoed with a weight that needed no explanation. He taught us. But it wasn't just a tribute. That was a mirror. Because whoever passed by there and looked at that coat saw themselves in some way reflected. It was as if Elias's silence spoke louder than all the speeches in the city combined. Rodrigo remained there for long minutes. He stared at the triangular patch, trying to understand why it all still hurt so much. It was a different kind of pain. It wasn't just remorse. It was a conscience that now weighed on him in a different way. He knew that the coat didn't just represent one veteran. It represented all those who had been erased, forgotten, discredited by a world that was too fast to listen to, those who walked slowly. The city went on with its routine, but the window stopped time. Everyone who entered the library slowed down when they saw the coat. Children asked who the owner of the hero's outfit was. Elderly people took off their hats as a sign of respect. A teenager left a note next to it. "Thank you for protecting my freedom even without knowing my name." And then Sunday came. It was the third day after the ceremony. The church was full as usual, but it was the military cemetery that filled up first. For the first time in years, residents from all over the city began to visit the tombstones regularly. Flowers were placed on previously forgotten graves, and right in the center, in front of a nameless tombstone, 2 white flowers continued to be changed every week. Rodrigo, now different, passed by there every morning. Always before office hours, sometimes alone. Sometimes with Irene, who left a cup of coffee at the foot of the tombstone, as if she were still serving Elias at Bank 12. Sometimes with the mayor, who never gave a long speech again since that event. That morning, however, something new happened. Rodrigo arrived earlier than usual, and he found someone already kneeling there. It wasn't Elias. It was a white-haired lady, her hands clasped tightly on her knee and her eyes fixed on the cold stone. She was trembling slightly, as if she were carrying a heavy memory. Rodrigo didn't say anything. He just stayed close. Until she, in a low, fragile voice, murmured, "I waited 52 years for a word from him. It never came. But now I understand. Silence was the word." And before getting up, he placed an envelope of old letters on the tombstone. Rodrigo didn't have the courage to read it. He simply understood that that story, that of Elijah, touched people far beyond what he could imagine. And then, as if fate had bided its time, a call came to the city hall. He was a journalist for a national magazine. Someone had published a photo of the general saluting. The image went viral. They wanted to know who the man was. Who was the last one of the triangular patch? Rodrigo hesitated. I didn't want to turn it into a spectacle. But he also knew that hiding Elias's story was perpetuating the silence he had carried alone for too long. Then he replied with one sentence. He was the kind of man who, even when silent, made the world run more smoothly. The article came out weeks later, and with it, letters began to arrive. From soldiers who said they heard his name on radios during evacuations, of families who remembered someone who once said that they owed their life to a faceless man who appeared at the right time, from grandchildren who today knew who Uncle Elias from the old stories was. Rodrigo read each one, and he kept them all in a wooden box next to his coat, inside the library. It was as if the world, little by little, began to sew back together what had been torn. The pain continued, but now it made sense, because Elias had won, even without fighting for recognition. He won in silence. He won in posture. He won by showing that there is greatness in the details that no one sees. And that Sunday, as he left the library, Rodrigo looked up at the sky. And for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. It wasn't euphoria, nor applause. It was just peace. If you've come this far, it's because something in this story touched you too. Maybe it reminded you of someone, or you simply felt that there is strength in silence, in respect, and in the little truths that we carry inside. If this content made sense to you, leave a comment with the phrase, "I carry that story with me." So, I know you were here until the end, and that to me means a lot. Take the opportunity to like the video, because this simple gesture helps keep the purpose of this channel alive. Telling stories that no one else tells, but that deserve to be heard. And if you feel that this type of content is valuable, subscribe to the channel. We are just beginning this journey, and there is much more to come. In fact, there is a video here that complements this message. Click and continue with me there.